Hi, and welcome to Scruffy Tales. This video will take a look at the Gripen fighter jet and how it might be useful for Ukraine in the war against the Russian invaders. I have a couple of more videos dealing with equipment being shipped to Ukraine, such as the CV-90 combat vehicle and the Archer artillery system, so please check them out if this sort of thing interests you. There's even a playlist dedicated to the subject. I must warn you though that those videos were recorded with not the best microphone. My plan is to re-record those videos to increase the audio quality. Anyway, in this video we will take a closer look at the Swedish fighter jet, the JAS-39 Gripen, or JAS-39 Gripen as we say in Swedish. We will take a quick look at its abilities, its history, but perhaps more importantly, the Air Force that requested it, that helped design it and place demands on what it had to be able to do. Because Swedish fighter jets are not produced by random companies and then sold to the Swedish Air Force. They are designed and built in a joint effort between the Defense Material Administration, known as the FMV, the Air Force, and one company in particular, Saab. And they do this to create very specific, tailor-made fighters that can operate in the specific doctrine decided by the armed forces and the Air Force. Gripen is a fighter jet that was designed and built to suit Swedish requirements, a fighter built to defend Sweden and for fighting on its own turf. It doesn't have the best range or the largest payload because it doesn't have to fly very far. It only needs to get into the air within Swedish borders, launch missiles, and then land and reload and refuel. In the 70s, discussions began on developing a new fighter, and in the early 80s, the decision was finally made. In 1983, work began on creating the fighter jet of the future. And in 1988, the first Gripen took to the skies, and in 1996, it entered into Swedish service. The name JAS-39 Gripen can be split up and explained as follows. JAS is short for Jakt, Attack, Spaning, which translates roughly to Hunt, Attack, Reconnaissance. Hunt in this context is the Swedish term for intercept. So the aircraft was built to handle all three mission types: intercepting enemy fighters, attacking ground targets, and conducting reconnaissance. You simply flipped a switch in the cockpit and equipped the aircraft accordingly to suit the mission. No need to bring in 5 different aircraft to solve the problem. 39 stands for the 39th airplane type in service in the Swedish Air Force. And Gripen is the Swedish word for Griffon, the mythological beast that was half lion, half eagle, a fitting name for an aircraft intended to be able to strike at both air and ground targets with equal success. According to Swedish pilot Carl Bergqvist, the Gripen only needs 300 meters of runway to land, and not a perfect runway at an Air Force base, but on a highway out in the woods. But before we continue with the Gripen, we will explore the environment in which it was designed and built, the doctrine it was intended to work within, and the Air Force that intended to fly it. At the end of World War II, Sweden's Air Force was not up to the task of defending its borders. For starters, at the beginning of the war, a full third of the Swedish Air Force, with pilots, planes, ground crew, weapons and fuel, everything, had been sent to Finland to fight the Soviet invasion. During the war, the Air Force had slowly grown and somewhat modernized. But it was clear that it could not withstand an all-out attack. And this was true for not just the Air Force, it was true for the Army and Navy as well. And now a great threat was growing in the east. The threat of a Soviet invasion was very much real. So Sweden needed a plan how to defeat an enemy with superior numbers on land, at sea, and in the air. As far as the Air Force was concerned, the first step was to not rely on foreign aircraft. With factories in the country, you could produce all the airplanes and spare parts you needed without the risk of important equipment being sunk at sea, or at least minimizing your reliance on shipments from abroad. That said, a lot of the engines Sweden would use were of foreign origins. The second requirement was perhaps the most bold of the requirements. The Air Force didn't just need good aircraft. They would be fighting a numerically superior enemy who also fielded some of the best fighters and bombers in the world. Sweden had no other option than to design and produce aircraft that would be as good or even better than those in use by the enemy to overcome the shortages in actual numbers that Sweden could put in the air. And the third requirement would turn out to be the most costly of them all. The Swedish Air Force needed the best pilots in the world. Their pilots couldn't just be good enough or considered to be good by NATO standards. They had to be the best to overcome the sheer numbers that the enemy could throw at them. And the cost of this requirement was not measured in money or time or resources. It was measured in human lives. Because if you were not good enough to fly in a Swedish fighter jet in accordance with the requirements of the Swedish Air Force, you would crash and die. And many pilots did die. A staggering amount of pilots died as they were pushed to be the best in the world. It became clear to the Swedish armed forces in the 50s that a Soviet invasion would include tactical nukes as well as traditional bomb runs, and the Swedish Air Force would be one of the first targets of an invasion. It was determined that during the first 48 to 72 hours, Sweden would lose most air bases and therefore most of the aircraft and their ability to wage a prolonged war. This was obviously not acceptable. So, in the 50s and in the 60s, the Air Force adopted the so-called Flygbas 60 system, Airbase 60. The new air bases were dispersed away from the main airfield, sometimes with depots and supplies located several kilometers away, all to avoid losing everything to a single enemy attack. To complement this, road bases were also established to be used if the main bases were taken out of action or overrun. So even if the Air Force lost its primary airfields, they could still remain operational by relocating to these stretches of road and set up temporary bases as needed. Even certain smaller civilian airfields were intended to be used in case of war. Sweden's Flygbas 60 system was proven a smart decision as in 1967 the Six-Day War erupted and Israel managed to destroy most of the Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground. The Six-Day War was evidence that the concept of the Flygbas 60 system was crucial for Sweden's defense. The concept was further improved as the Flygbas 90 system was introduced. Conceived in the 70s and 80s, the Airbase 90 system intended to make Swedish airfields even less static, adding more runways to the bases and expanding on the road base network. The new runways were only 800 meters long and around 17 meters wide. And with the stall capabilities of the Viggen fighter and later the Gripen, even shorter stretches of road could be used as reserve airfields. On top of it, even more civilian airfields were included in the Airbase 90 system. The Swedish Air Force became an air force designed for guerrilla warfare, launching from one airfield and landing on another. If a base was attacked, a road could be used instead. If an aircraft needed to be quickly rearmed and refueled, the ground crew could drive out into the woods and link up with the aircraft on a road and get it back into the air in less than 20 or 30 minutes. The idea was to make it impossible for an enemy to defeat the Swedish Air Force on the ground. The only way to defeat Swedish fighters was to engage them in the air and shoot them down, and that was not the easiest of tasks. Throughout the Cold War, Sweden would create some of the world's most legendary aircraft, innovative, advanced, and even revolutionary. And at the heart of these achievements, we find the Swedish Aeroplane Stock Company, in Swedish Svenska Aeroplan Aktiebolag, more commonly known as Saab. In 1951, a truly legendary aircraft entered into Swedish service after only 3 years of development, the Saab 29 Tunnan, the Barrel. Based on German aircraft designs from World War II, this was an aircraft truly on par with the best of American or Soviet fighters, such as MiG-15 and F-86. In 1954, the Tunnan set a world record in reaching an average top speed of 977 kilometers per hour over a distance of 500 kilometers. In 1955, another world record was set, as a Tunnan had an average top speed of 900 kilometers per hour over a distance of 1,000 kilometers. In 1958, a squadron of reconnaissance-configured Tunnan took part in a daring mission over enemy territory. With all markings painted over with black stripes, Tunnan jets conducted several missions over Warsaw Pact installations along the length of the Baltic coastline, flying as low as 10 to 20 meters off the ground, photographing several military installations as they shot over the enemy bases at top speed. During the Congo crisis of 1960 to 1964, the UN utilized Tunnan fighters to strike at rebels and mercenaries. During a raid against an enemy airfield, a reconnaissance Tunnan flew across the target airfield at only 20 meters off the ground. The photographs taken allowed the other Tunnan fighters to move in with rockets and accurately strike the enemy aircraft. Not a single decoy had been targeted, only actual hostile aircraft. The Tunnan would serve with the Swedish Air Force until 1976. In 1955, another legendary Saab aircraft entered into Swedish service, the Saab 32 Lansen, the Lance. It was designed to be used in 3 configurations to replace older aging aircraft. Lansen versions would serve as interceptors for ground attack and for reconnaissance. It would be in service up until 1997. The attack version would use a crew of 2, where the navigator would help guide the pilot into position to strike at ground targets. These attack aircraft were known as the Supreme Commander's sledgehammer, for the massive amount of bombs and rockets they would unleash on a potential enemy. The attack wings of Lansen were famous for their morbid view of their mission. Their job was to fly one strike mission after the other and attack the enemy as he was trying to establish beachheads on the Swedish mainland, until they could fly no more. Casualty rates were expected to be in the extreme if an actual war erupted, so much so that the sledge of the Swedish Air Force was considered suicidal and only able to perform 3 or 4 proper strikes. Lansen would go on to become one of the world's most feared weapons during the Cold War, since it was also equipped with the world's first anti-ship missile, the Swedish designed and built Robot 4, taken into production in 1958. A fire and forget missile that skimmed the surface of the ocean and then would rise to fly in over the target to perform a top attack against the weaker protection of the ship's top deck. Saab 35 Draken is yet another Cold War legend. The name Draken in this case refers to a kite. However, Draken is also the Swedish word for dragon, a far more fitting name for this futuristic-looking beast of the skies. Draken was the first European-made supersonic fighter and did its first flight in 1955. Intended to intercept Soviet high-altitude bombers, its design would prove that the Draken could also function as a low-altitude fighter. Designed with a so-called double delta wing, the design was the reason the aircraft could function so well both at high altitude and low altitude. The Draken was also the first fighter jet in the world capable of performing the so-called Cobra maneuver, and was even taught as a tactical exploit to be used in dogfights. The Draken would serve in Sweden until 1999, but Austria took it out of service as late as in 2005. In 1967, an aircraft took to the skies for the very first time, and not just any aircraft, an aircraft that would send a clear message across the Baltic Sea. If you come here uninvited, you will not return home alive. It was the Saab 37 Viggen, the lightning of Thor. Specifically designed with stall, short takeoff and landing capability to perfectly fit with the Airbase 60 system and later the Airbase 90 system. The forward canards of the aircraft reduced its takeoff and landing requirements to only 500 meters. The Viggen was also designed to be maintained in the field during harsh conditions by conscripts. Refueling, rearming and readying a Viggen required only one technician, 5 conscripts, and could be achieved in less than 10 minutes. The Viggen was robust, durable and powerful, one of the most advanced and deadly fighters of its era, and it was built to be a guerrilla fighter in disguise, operating from random woodland roads, linking up with a small team of conscripts, and would be back in the fight in only a few minutes. In 1981, Viggens launched from their airbase armed with live warheads. A Russian submarine had found itself stranded in Swedish waters, and Soviet warships were heading to bring it back home. Sweden had other plans and prepared to sink any Soviet ship that entered Swedish territory. 400 meters from Swedish territorial waters, the Soviet ships came to a halt, and the Viggens and the coastal artillery could stand down, at least temporarily. In 1985, a maritime version of the Viggen was flying reconnaissance close to a Soviet squadron of warships. 2 Russian fighters appeared out of nowhere and took chase. After a couple of maneuvers, the Swedish pilot took his Viggen through a tight turn at high speed only 100 meters over the ocean surface. The Soviet aircraft on Su-15 could not keep up and crashed into the ocean and exploded, the pilot dying instantly. The Viggen hit its afterburners at only 50 meters over the ocean, still followed by the second Soviet fighter. But as 2 more Viggen were rushing in to help their comrade, the last Soviet fighter broke off and returned home. And perhaps more famously, in 1987, 4 Viggen escorted an SR-71 Blackbird out of harm's way while being chased by as many as 25 Soviet fighter jets. The Blackbird ended up with engine trouble over the Baltic Sea and could not maintain altitude. The Soviets were quick to send fighters to intercept and force the American spy plane to the ground. Sweden had 2 Viggen in the area, conducting training. They were deployed to escort the Blackbird while being unarmed. Eventually, 2 fully armed Viggen could take over and escort the Blackbird to NATO territory, surrounded by Soviet fighters itching to open fire on the American aircraft. For their actions, the 4 Swedish pilots were eventually awarded the U.S. Air Medal for Bravery 31 years later, after the incident had been declassified. And speaking of the Viggen and the Blackbird, several Swedish Viggen pilots managed to achieve missile lock on the Blackbird as it ventured into Swedish airspace over the years. This was achieved by going at Mach 2 to the Blackbird's altitude and go at it from the front instead of trying to come up behind it. This allowed the Viggen to acquire missile locks on several occasions on the elusive spy plane. From early on, the Swedish Air Force decided that the only way their pilots could truly be up to the task of facing and defeating a Russian invasion force was if the pilots flew and trained as if it was an actual war. It would serve no purpose to fly and train as if you did not have to avoid enemy radar or avoid enemy aircraft. It would not prepare the Swedish pilots for the harsh realities of a real war. Pilots trained at dangerously low levels, quite literally at treetop level, at full speed at that. Accidents were frequent as aircraft struck trees with their fuselage and wings. Flying low was necessary to avoid enemy radar and anti-air guns. If you could not handle low-level flying at full throttle in peacetime, how would you be able to do it in an actual war? Swedish pilots had to master low-level flying at full speed. If they couldn't, they crashed and died. Only the best of the best could be fighter pilots. Those who tried and failed died. Compare this to the US Air Force, who did not fly lower than 100 meters during the Cold War, and the loss of life the US suffered in Vietnam because their pilots had not trained to fly in wartime conditions. RAF pilot Mike Rondot, a veteran of the Gulf War with 29 combat missions under his belt, recalls in an interview his encounters with Swedish pilots and the Viggen. He remembers flying with Swedish pilots who took them down to 10 meters over the ground at 600 kilometers per hour in poor weather. And he does not hesitate in explaining that the Swedish pilots were the best trained pilots in the world. A pair of Swedish Viggens at one time flew so low at such high speeds right past a US Navy vessel that the Americans had not seen the Viggens on radar and thought it was Soviet fighters thundering past them dangerously close. Surprised, the US sailors went to high alert, not knowing where the fighters had come from or whom they belonged to. In the 90s, Swedish pilots visited the US to take part in the Top Gun program, the school created in response to the losses suffered in Vietnam, to teach the important skills of dogfighting and low-level flying. Upon returning to Sweden, the Swedish pilots said that Top Gun offered little that standard Swedish fighter pilot training did not already teach the Swedish pilots. Sweden's current Supreme Commander of its armed forces served as a Viggen pilot, and has in an interview told stories of how he landed his Viggen with twigs and branches stuck to the aircraft. During the Congo crisis, Swedish pilot Thor Glans received the Vasa Medal for his heroic actions during combat, as he continuously used his scout aircraft as a weapon, flying in so low he could strike enemy combatants with his airplane. He did this to prevent hordes of hostiles from reaching the helicopters that had landed to rescue civilians from being captured and killed by murderous militias. I actually have made a video about this mission called JDEX-1, so please check it out. It is an incredible story to say the least. This level of training did not come without cost. Numerous aircraft were lost to accidents when they struck trees or the ground, or even other aircraft. The pilots trained against each other in proper formations, at full speed in close dogfights at low level. The training had to be realistic. It had to prepare the pilots for the real thing, because only then would they have the upper hand against the numerically superior enemy. Some 500 Swedish pilots died during the Cold War, training for a war that thankfully never came. This was the world in which the Gripen was envisioned, designed, and built. Guerrilla warfare in the skies, high-speed chases touching treetops, dogfights when outnumbered, and with a demand to be the best fighter jet available, to be piloted by the best fighter pilots available, equipped with the best systems and weapons available. Requiring only 300 meters of runway, with a small team of 1 technician and 5 conscripts that can refuel and rearm a Gripen in 10 minutes or less. Gripen can communicate between each other and act as their own AWACS, Together with the Stril combat control system, Gripen of the Swedish Air Force can quickly prepare for new missions, new eventualities, and always be ready to engage the enemy. Stril does require a brief mention onto its own, as the Swedish Air Force was the first in the world to provide their fighters with reliable digital information in real time that was functional even with interference. A system taken into service as early as the 50s and continuously upgraded over the decades, and Stril is still in use today in the form of a state-of-the-art combat guidance system. If you want information on speed, altitude, hardpoints, etc., you will have to watch another video or just read on Wikipedia. I can tell you that the latest Gripen has a larger airframe to allow for more fuel and more weaponry. What I hope I have provided you with is the world that the Gripen was born out of, the requirements needed for this aircraft to even be considered by the Swedish Air Force. The Gripen was built to excel at low altitude, at treetop level, to operate from bombed runways and makeshift airfields out in the forests, and to be maintained by as few specialists as possible, requiring only one specialized tool to do as many tasks as possible during reloading and refueling. At the flip of a switch, Gripen can swap between its three main configurations of interception, ground attack, and reconnaissance. A Gripen could drop small diameter bombs on a target, land on a highway, and 10 minutes later be back in the air with missiles, engaging enemy fighters, land on a bombed runway, and 20 minutes later be back in the air, going out to sea and launching anti-ship missiles at incoming enemy vessels, head back to land, and on a road in the woods, rearrange everything to do reconnaissance and then do a low-level flight to photograph enemy positions around the beachhead. According to one source, when the Gripen took part in the Red Flag exercise of 2006, Gripen was the only fighter participating that never lost an aerial encounter or failed a mission objective, and it was the only fighter that performed all planned starts, while others would wait for the weather to clear up. The latest Gripen version even has heat tracking sensors that can detect the air friction created by aircraft as they move through the air, as in the capability of detecting aircraft relying on stealth technology. With the right conditions, a Gripen can acquire a missile lock and kill stealth fighters. Speaking of stealth, we must mention the Gripen's incredible electronic warfare capabilities. As Gripen does not rely on stealth, it uses advanced electronic jamming and disturbance equipment to hide from the enemy, fooling and tricking hostile systems and making it all but impossible to acquire a proper missile lock on the Gripen. Systems that can be replaced, upgraded, and tweaked as needed as technology improves. Something that can't really be done with stealth technology. If you want better stealth, you need to design and build a completely new aircraft. Not so with the Gripen, up to a point. If Ukraine receives Gripen fighters, they will most likely be older versions and not the latest with all the cool fancy equipment and capabilities. But even the older versions still provide the juice that makes the Gripen fundamentally impressive. Excellent stall capabilities, no need for a full host of skilled technicians to keep them operational, excellent dogfighting abilities, and the ability to land on a piece of road and be back in a fight in 10 minutes. So, Ukraine might not get the fancy electronic warfare systems, but they will get things that are useful. Ukraine might not get Meteor missiles, but the Gripen can launch most, if not all, NATO missiles. Ukraine will get a plane that can intercept Russian fighters, land, get back into the air, and then bomb Russian forces, land, get back in the air, and scout Russian positions so that artillery will strike accurately, land, rearm, and get back in the air and attack Russian fighters again, all in the space of a few hours, relying on a single aircraft, not 2 or 3 or 4, 1. Nothing in the Western arsenal comes close to this. No other aircraft in Western service available today can fight a guerrilla war in the skies. This is the domain of the Gripen and the Gripen alone. In the 50s, the Swedish armed forces realized that a war with the Soviet Union would require that every part of the Swedish Army, Navy, and Air Force had to rely on guerrilla tactics to overcome the enemy. Everything needs to be able to do hit and run attacks, everything needs to be able to operate behind enemy lines, everything needs as little logistical support as possible. And as far as the Swedish Air Force goes, this is manifested in full in the JAS 39 Gripen. The Gripen is a small aircraft compared to many others in NATO service. This reduces its range in terms of fuel capacity, but also the number of missiles and bombs it can carry. But since it is smaller, it can make tighter turns, it can make faster turns. This is not unimportant. In a dogfight, however unusual they may be in modern warfare, being able to turn fast and tight is absolutely essential for survival. And even in BVR combat, beyond visual range, being able to turn quickly is still crucial, because if a missile is launched at you, you want to turn away as quickly as possible, drop countermeasures, and fly low to try and shake the missile. Turning away is important because you basically are trying to outrun the missile, because as soon as it runs out of fuel, it loses speed trying to catch up to your aircraft. So the faster you can turn around, the faster you can try and outrun the incoming missile trying to kill you. Provide Ukraine with Gripen, and provide them with proper missiles, possibly even the Meteor, the most advanced air-to-air missile in the world, a missile the Gripen carries in its Swedish service, then Ukraine will undoubtedly gain air superiority with the ability to gun down any and all Russian fighters coming their way. That's it for now. I hope you have enjoyed this brief look at the Gripen and the environment that spawned it. There are several other videos on YouTube that tells us that Gripen is a good choice for Ukraine and of its capabilities, but not that many tells us exactly why Gripen is good for Ukraine, or even why it was designed the way it was. Gripen was built to be flown by the best pilots in the world, to be flown in wartime conditions, to be operated in the worst conditions imaginable. Not many other aircraft can say the same. Anyway, that will have to be it. See you in the next one. Gå på marsch, Ukraine!